On April 5, 1892, 52 men boarded a secret train in Cheyenne, Wyoming. They carried a list of 70 names. Every man on that list was marked for death. The shooters were promised $50 in gold for each one they killed. The richest cattlemen in America had just hired a private army, and nobody knew they were coming. Within 5 days, 200 armed ranchers would have them surrounded on an open prairie. Within 7, the United States cavalry would ride in at full gallop to save them from being torn apart by the very people they came to murder. This is the true story of the Johnson County War, and it is unlike any version you have ever been told. The train left Cheyenne in the middle of the night. 3 rail cars, no passengers on the manifest. The conductor had been paid in silver to ask no questions. Inside those cars sat the wealthiest men in the territory of Wyoming. Bankers, politicians, cattle barons whose herds covered 10,000 square miles of open range. Beside them sat 23 Texas gunmen, hand-picked from the worst saloons of Paris, Texas. Men with reputations for murder. Men who had killed for far less than $50 before. They had crates of Winchester rifles, cases of dynamite, boxes of cartridges. Enough ammunition, one witness later said, to kill every man in the state of Wyoming. The leader of this expedition was a former Union Army officer named Major Frank Wolcott. Short, square-jawed, arrogant, with a thick gray mustache and a temper that had cost him friends and fortunes for 30 years. Beside him rode the second commander, Frank Canton, a former sheriff turned hired killer, a man with a face like dry leather and eyes that never seemed to blink. Canton carried the kill list inside his coat. 70 names, sheriffs, county commissioners, newspaper editors, small ranchers. Every name on that paper was an enemy of the cattle barons. Every name was a death sentence already signed. The plan was simple. Ride north, cut every telegraph wire from Casper to the Montana border, seize the town of Buffalo before sunrise, hang every man on the list before the rest of Wyoming even knew they were there. They expected resistance from no one. They had the governor's silent approval. They had 2 senators in their pockets. They had 3 newspapers in Cheyenne already writing the headlines that would call them heroes. Just past Casper, the train hissed to a stop. The men unloaded their horses, saddled up under a cold black sky, and rode north into the Powder River country. By dawn, they had cut every wire in their path. The territory was now blind. The territory was now deaf. And 100 miles ahead of them, in a small log cabin on the edge of a frozen creek, a man named Nate Champion was sleeping with his rifle by the bed. He had no idea his name was first on the list. Before the killers reached his cabin that morning, Nate Champion had already survived their first attempt on his life. They had tried to murder him 5 months earlier. He had killed one of them with a Colt revolver from under his pillow. And that was exactly why his name was first on the list. Champion was 35 years old, a Texan by birth, a cowboy by trade, a man who had ridden the Chisholm Trail when most of the men hunting him were still children. 6 feet tall, broad in the shoulders, dark-haired, with a mustache so black it looked painted on. He had come to Wyoming as a hired ranch hand. He had stayed because he saw something the cattle barons refused to see. He saw that a poor man could own land in the Powder River country. He saw that 160 acres claimed under the Homestead Act could feed a family. He saw that the open range belonged to no one and everyone. And he was not afraid to say it out loud. That made him dangerous. The cattle barons hated him for it. They hated the small ranchers who fenced off creeks. They hated the cowboys who quit their crews to start their own herds. They called these men rustlers. They called them thieves. The truth was simpler. They called them anything that justified killing them. In November of 1891, Frank Canton sent 4 armed men to a small ranch on the Powder River, where Champion was sleeping. They crept up to the door before sunrise. They opened it slowly. They aimed their rifles at the bed, but Nate Champion had a Colt revolver hidden under his pillow. He fired before they could pull a trigger. The man closest to him died on the cabin floor. The others ran into the dark. Champion was left with powder burns on his face and the certainty of one terrible fact. Someone had paid those men to kill him, and whoever it was would try again. He spent the next 5 months telling everyone in Johnson County who would listen. He named names. He filed reports. He testified in a Buffalo courtroom against a stock detective named Joe Elliott. The case was building. The cattle barons were running out of time. If Champion lived to testify, the entire murder-for-hire scheme would be exposed in open court. The senators in Washington would not be able to look away. And so, On the cold morning of April 9, 1892, 50 men on horseback rode quietly into the meadow above the KC Ranch. They tied their horses in the trees. They moved through the brush in single file. They surrounded the cabin from every direction. Inside, Nate Champion was already awake. He was making coffee. He had no idea the meadow above him was full of guns. At first, Nate Champion did not hear them. He was inside the cabin. The fire was crackling. The coffee was almost ready. 2 trappers who had stopped at the KC Ranch the night before were still asleep in the corner, and his friend Nick Ray was standing at the open doorway, watching the cold morning sky. Then Champion heard the bolt of a rifle. Nick Ray was the first man to die in the Johnson County War. He took 2 bullets in the chest before he could move. He fell backward into the cabin. Champion grabbed him by the collar and dragged him through the dirt floor toward the back wall. Outside, the gunfire began to roar. Bullets tore through the wooden planks like paper. The trappers, terrified, scrambled out the back door and were captured immediately. Now there were only 2 men inside the cabin. One of them was already dying. Nate Champion crawled to the small log table in the corner. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and a stub of a pencil. The bullets were still flying. The walls were splintering above his head, and in the middle of all that, with his friend bleeding out beside him, he began to write. Me and Nick was getting breakfast when the attack took place. 2 men were with us. The old man went after water and did not come back. His friend went out to see what was the matter, and he did not come back either. Nick is shot but not dead yet. He is awful sick. I must go and wait on him. Outside, Major Wolcott was furious. The plan had been to take the cabin in 5 minutes. It was now 9 in the morning. Then 10, then 11. Champion was still firing back from inside. They could not see him. They could not flush him out. Every man who tried to rush the door was driven back by his rifle. Wolcott was sweating under his coat. The longer they stayed in that valley, the more the territory could wake up, the more Wyoming could find out. By noon, a passing rancher named Jack Flagg crested a ridge and saw them from a distance. He saw 50 armed men around a single cabin on the Powder River. He saw the muzzle flashes. He saw the bodies of horses they had shot in the corral. Flagg turned his wagon around and whipped his team into a hard run. 60 miles to Buffalo. 60 miles to find Sheriff Red Angus. 60 miles between Nate Champion and the only men in Wyoming who could save him. Inside the cabin, Champion kept writing. He wrote about Nick Ray dying in his arms. He wrote about the men outside. He wrote as if he already knew no one would arrive in time. And then around 2 in the afternoon, he heard a sound through the walls that told him exactly how this was going to end. He heard the crackling of dry brush being piled against the back of the cabin. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, the back wall of the KC Ranch was on fire. Nate Champion had a choice: burn alive inside the cabin, or step out into 50 rifles. He chose the rifles. Before he opened the door, he wrote his last words on the folded paper at his feet. Well, they have just got through shelling the house like hail. I heard them say they had Frank Smith. I don't know what they intend to do with me. It is now about 3 o'clock. I think I will make a break when night comes if alive. Shoot first. Goodbye, boys, if I never see you again. He folded the paper and pushed it into the inside pocket of his vest. He took his Colt revolver in one hand and a hunting knife in the other. He looked one last time at Nick Ray on the dirt floor. He kicked open the back door of the burning cabin, and he ran. He made it 40 yards. 28 bullets struck him before he hit the ground. He fell on his face in the cold spring grass beside the Powder River. The men who had killed him stood over the body for a long moment. Then Frank Canton walked up. He pulled a pin from his own coat and pinned a small piece of paper to Champion's vest. The paper read 3 words: "Cattle thieves beware." But that paper would be the most expensive mistake of Frank Canton's life, because the diary in Champion's pocket was still there. The killers searched the body. They found it. They tore out the pages where Champion had named some of them by name, but they did not destroy the rest. They left the journal in the dead man's vest where it lay. By morning, it would be in the hands of a newspaper reporter from the Chicago Herald who had ridden along with the expedition to record their victory. By the end of the month, it would be quoted in every newspaper in the United States. Every word Nate Champion had written from inside that burning cabin would be read aloud in saloons, in churches, in the floor of the United States Senate. The cattle barons did not know it yet, but they had just lost the war for the soul of America. The dead man at their feet was about to become the most famous homesteader who ever lived. Major Wolcott looked north. The sun was already low. They had wasted an entire day on one man with one rifle. They mounted up. They rode toward Buffalo. They believed the worst was behind them. They believed nothing could stop them now. They were wrong. 60 miles ahead of them, on the steps of the Johnson County Courthouse, Jack Flagg had just dropped from his exhausted horse, and Sheriff Red Angus was already reaching for the rope of the courthouse bell. When Sheriff Red Angus pulled the bell rope at the Johnson County Courthouse on the night of April 9th, every farmer, rancher, blacksmith, and cowboy within 30 miles of Buffalo grabbed his rifle and rode toward the sound. They came in wagons. They came on horseback. They came on foot. They came carrying old shotguns from the Civil War. They came carrying Winchesters they had bought with one season's pay. They came because the bell only rang for one reason. Something terrible had happened on the Powder River. Within 12 hours, 200 armed men were gathered in the streets of Buffalo. Sheriff Red Angus stood on the courthouse steps and read out what Jack Flagg had told him. 50 hired killers. A list of 70 names. The bodies of Nick Ray and Nate Champion at the KC Ranch. Every man in that crowd knew someone on the list. Every man knew his own name might be on the list. There was no debate. There was no vote. They saddled up and rode south at dawn on April 10th. Red Angus led them. Tall, robust, red-bearded, his star pinned to a plain wool coat. He had been a cowboy for 20 years. He had fought in the Indian Wars before that. He had seen what powerful men did when they believed no one was watching. He had no intention of letting them get away with it again. Meanwhile, Major Wolcott and his invaders were already on the road north toward Buffalo. They were 18 miles south of town when a single horseman appeared on the horizon. He was riding hard away from Buffalo. He saw the invaders. He turned his horse sideways, and he stared at them long enough to count. Wolcott understood instantly. Word had reached Buffalo. Whatever surprise they had once held was gone. He pulled his men off the road and into the cottonwoods. They held a hurried council on horseback. Some wanted to keep advancing and take the town anyway. Others wanted to retreat all the way to Cheyenne. Frank Canton spoke last, and what he said decided it. He said if they rode into Buffalo, they would all hang from the courthouse beams by sunset. They turned around. They rode east through the brush. They knew of a place where they could fortify. A small horse ranch with a strong barn built of hewn logs, surrounded by open prairie on 3 sides. The TA Ranch. They reached it by nightfall. They began stacking sandbags inside the barn. They cut firing slots in the walls. They piled rocks against the doors. They prepared to defend themselves against an enemy they did not yet realize was already on the way. By the morning of April 11th, 200 ranchers were riding hard down the wagon road from Buffalo. By noon, they would crest the ridge above the TA Ranch, and the men who had murdered Nate Champion were about to discover what it felt like to be the hunted. By noon on April 11th, the first rifle shots cracked across the prairie above the TA Ranch. Inside the log barn, 50 men ducked low. They had spent the night fortifying every entrance, stacking sandbags, cutting firing slits between the logs. They had brought enough ammunition to fight for a week. What they had not brought was a way out. Major Wolcott crawled to a slit in the north wall and looked toward the ridge. What he saw stopped his breath. 200 ranchers spread along the high ground in a long arc, on horseback, cutting off every escape route. He could see Sheriff Red Angus on a tall bay, his red beard visible from a quarter-mile away. He could see homesteaders he recognized from the towns of Buffalo and Casey. He could see the brothers and cousins of the men he had paid Texans to kill. Frank Canton crawled up beside him. The 2 men did not speak. There was nothing to say. The ranchers did not charge. Red Angus had served in the Indian Wars. He knew how to break a fortified position without losing his own men. He set up a perimeter at 400 yards. He posted snipers at every angle. He sent men to cut the well rope so the invaders could not draw water. By the second day, the food inside the barn was rationed to 2 biscuits per man. By the second night, the only water came from a small spring the ranchers had not yet found. Then Red Angus did something the cattle barons had not expected. He told his men to start building. For 36 hours, the ranchers worked in shifts. They tore apart wagons. They cut down cottonwoods from the creek. They built what the newspapers would later call the Go Devil, a wooden fortress on wheels, 2 stories tall, faced with logs 3 feet thick, designed to roll across the open prairie under fire. From its top deck, riflemen could shoot down into the barn while bullets from below bounced off the timber walls. When the Go Devil was finished, the ranchers were going to push it within 20 yards of the barn and burn the cattle barons out where they stood. Inside the barn, Major Wolcott understood that he had 36 hours to live, maybe less. He scrawled a desperate message on a scrap of paper. He folded it into the boot of his fastest cowboy. The man slipped out the back of the barn at midnight, crawled half a mile through the brush, found a horse the ranchers had missed, and rode south at full gallop. The message was addressed to Cheyenne, but it would not stop in Cheyenne. It would not stop in Wyoming at all. Inside that boot was a single piece of paper that, within 36 hours, would be placed in the hands of the President of the United States. The paper inside that cowboy's boot traveled 600 miles in 28 hours. It reached Acting Governor Amos Barber in Cheyenne by the afternoon of April 12th. It reached the desk of United States Senator Joseph Carey by sundown. By midnight, Carey was inside a closed carriage rolling through the streets of Washington toward the White House. He had only one mission: wake the President of the United States before sunrise. Benjamin Harrison was 60 years old, a former Civil War general, a man who did not like being woken up. But Senator Carey told him things in that bedroom no senator had ever told a sitting president. He told him the most powerful men in Wyoming were trapped inside a barn. He told him they had killed 2 homesteaders in cold blood. He told him 200 citizens were about to burn them out alive. And he told him those citizens were within their legal rights to do so. President Harrison did not say yes. He did not say no. He picked up his pen. He signed an order to the 6th Cavalry stationed at Fort McKinney, less than 15 miles from the TA Ranch. The order was 3 lines long. Take 3 full troops. Ride to the TA Ranch. Bring back the invaders alive at any cost. The order traveled by telegraph, by horseback courier, by signal fire. It reached Fort McKinney at 4 in the morning of April 13th. By dawn, 3 full troops of cavalry were saddled and riding south at full gallop. At the same hour, the ranchers at the TA Ranch were finishing the Go Devil. They had pushed it onto a low rise above the barn. They had loaded it with kerosene-soaked rags and dynamite. They had selected the men who would push it across the field. The plan was simple: roll it within 50 feet of the barn, light the fuses, burn out the men who had murdered Nate Champion. The first push began at 6 in the morning. The ranchers sweated and shoved against the wooden frame. They moved it 20 yards, 40, 60. The men inside the barn fired through the slits. Bullets struck the logs and stopped dead. Inside the wheeled fortress, the ranchers could hear the cattle barons shouting at each other in panic. They could smell the kerosene through the cracks. They were 80 yards from the barn, 60, 40, and then they heard the bugle. It came from the North Ridge, faint at first, then louder, a military bugle, a cavalry charge. Then they saw them, 3 full troops of United States cavalry, 300 men in blue, riding hard across the prairie at full gallop, guidons flapping in the wind, a long dust trail rising behind them. The invaders inside the barn were about to be saved by the same federal government their hired killers had been counting on all along. The bugle was a relief no one inside the barn deserved. By 11 in the morning of April 13th, 3 full troops of cavalry rode down the slope between the ranchers and the TA Ranch. Their commander was Colonel J.J. Van Horn. He raised a white handkerchief on the tip of his saber. He rode straight between the 2 armed sides without slowing. Major Wolcott stepped out of the barn, dirty, bearded, powder-streaked. He saluted the colonel stiffly, the way old soldiers salute, and then he said the line that newspapers across America would print word for word the next morning. He said, "I will surrender to you, Colonel, but to that man," and he pointed at Sheriff Red Angus on the ridge, "never." 44 invaders were marched out under cavalry escort. 2 of the Texan gunmen had already died inside the barn from wounds taken during the siege. The rest were taken to Fort McKinney, then to Fort D.A. Russell in Cheyenne. They were charged with murder. They were charged with conspiracy. They were charged with crimes that should have hanged every one of them. But the trial never came. The cattle barons paid for the most expensive lawyers in the territory. They paid newspapers to call the invaders heroes. They paid for witnesses to disappear. Johnson County, sparsely populated, ran out of money trying to feed and house the prisoners. After 14 months of delay, the prosecution dropped every charge. The invaders walked free. The Texans rode south and were never seen in Wyoming again. Frank Canton fled to Oklahoma under another name. Major Wolcott returned to his ranch and died 10 years later, broken and forgotten. But what the cattle barons could not pay for was the vote. In November of 1892, every Republican who had supported the invaders lost his seat. The Democratic Party swept Wyoming. The most powerful Republican senator in the territory, the man who had sat in Cheyenne offices and approved the kill list, lost his Senate seat in a landslide. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association lost its grip on the legislature. The newspapers that had defended the murders went bankrupt one by one. Nate Champion, the cowboy who had written his last words inside a burning cabin, became the most famous homesteader in American history. His diary was reprinted in newspapers from New York to San Francisco. School children memorized his final lines. Statues were raised in his memory. The man the cattle barons had paid $50 to silence had become the voice of the entire frontier. And the open range, the great unfenced ocean of grass that the cattle barons had ruled like kings, was gone within a decade. Barbed wire crossed every meadow. Homesteaders claimed every creek. The cattle barons sold their herds at a loss and moved east. The Old West they had fought to keep died in a barn on the TA Ranch in April of 1892, and it was a small Texan rancher with 28 bullets in his back who had killed it. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the Old West, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything.